We have a panel today that will mostly focus on cosmic connections, but as you could see, you can do pretty much address pretty much any aspects of Charles' work. Okay, so our first speaker will be Paolo Costa. Paolo is a philosopher in the Religious Studies Department at the Bruno Kessler Foundation in Trento. Paolo?
Thank you to the organizer for having me and for spoiling me, yes, indeed, in this memorable 3 days. Well, I didn't study in Oxford. I had neither at McGill. I studied in Milan and in Parma, but I see my personal relationship with Charles as a classic teacher-pupil relationship. So a relationship fraught with a sense of personal depth that is difficult to pay. So my attempt today is to try again to repay this debt by discussing our shared love of poetry. Yeah, whatever poetry might mean. So the term articulation and the verb to articulate play a special role in Taylor's thought. The best way to explain this prominence is to relate it to how consciousness works. For to be conscious is to be responsive to the significance and value of what is encountered in your life word. This sense of import is the basis of sentient life. It is, well, this is my comparison, it is like wonder with respect to philosophy, according to Plato's and Aristotle's picture of this thoughtful emotion. I mean, the most ingenious way to react to the incipient differences of significance or value you encounter in your environment is to articulate them, to unfold them, make them as accessible as possible. Consciousness is this kind of responsiveness. It is articulacy. When we describe coming into the world as a kind of recursive second birth, we are referring, I guess, precisely to our access to increasingly subtler forms of articulated experience. There are many forms of articulacy. Some are trivially linked with the ordinary needs and purposes that saturate the intentional environment of animals. By saying trivially, I don't want to imply that this way of coming at grips with the word is no interesting puzzle. You only have to think about the interest aroused by the discovery of mirror neurons to realize what complexity, including brain complexity, lies beyond the agent's practical grasp of the affordances embodied in their field of action. But, well, my first claim is what is most striking about humans' mode of coping with the world is that quality of attention that a philosopher important, Charles Herder, famously called, I use the German word, Besonnenheit, thoughtfulness. Or maybe a better translation is, but it's difficult to pronounce, to considerateness. Underlying Besonnenheit is a distinctive desire, the desire to linger close to things in order to apprehend them better. And this desire persists despite the systematic frustration of our desire to feel at home in the world. This kind of attention, I surmise, is inherently poetic. In what sense? That's what I want to explain to you today. To begin with, it is a gesture of regard, a way of getting involved, of approaching things, circling around them, discerning, and valuing analogies in order to turn something vaguely familiar into something known. Especially when the events or things in questions are natural phenomena, this way of savoring them without disturbing them expresses a desire to make contact with the energy the force, the enigmatic spontaneity of nature, of which we ourselves are an expression and which we first of all experience in our own lived bodies. Beyond the night, so this thoughtfulness would not be such a special quality of the soul if the sin, beyond the night, yes, it embodies, wasn't imbued, soaked with sensuousness. So the bridge between the, let's call it the ideal dimension and the bodily dimension of a sin lies right at the heart of this distinctive experience of the word. In Cosmic Connections, Charles usefully describes this bridging experience in terms of the access to an interspace, where the experience of articulating the implicit reaches its peak, so to speak. In his book, Charles tracks down this foundational experience in a time when, for reason he has investigated throughout his career, a skeptical habitus is spreading all over the place, and confidence in the possibility of justifying the very idea of making contact with the word is gradually receding. The image of the epistemic retreat captures well this escalating loss of contact. At some point in Western history, disengagement, so to speak, prevails over beyond the night. Now, so when this happens, what is seen as a penchant for analogical reasoning or for prominent what Alison Gopnik calls lantern consciousness appear to be intellectual faults, clear signs of immaturity. To keep the buffer self now wonders whether poetry is still possible after Newton. However, Charles forcefully shows in his book how this structural misgiving does not prevent many post-romantic poets from seeking oblique ways to reconnect with the word well lost. Contemporary poetry also teems with examples of the unresolved tension between a robust desire for reconnection and failed consideration. I have selected one of my favorites. It is a prose by a Canadian poet, Gaonkar. It is a long quote, so I beg your pardon, but see it as a sort of preparation for a read of Cosmic Connection that requires patience. So let me read this long quote. It was the year my brother died. I lived up north and had few friends, or they all went away. Christmas Day, I was sitting in my armchair reading something about Hegel. You will forgive me if you are someone who knows a lot of Hegel or understands it. I don't. I will paraphrase badly, but I understood him to be saying that he was fed up with popular criticism of his terrible prose and claiming that conventional grammar, with its clumsy dichotomy of subject and verb, was in conflict with what he called speculation. Speculation being the proper business of philosophy, speculation being the effort to grasp reality in its interactive entirety. The function of sentence like reason is spirit was not to assert a fact, he said, but to lay reason side by side with spirit and allow their meaning to tenderly mingle in speculation. I was overjoyed by this notion of a philosophic space where words drift in gentle, mutual redefinition of one another, but at the same time, wretchedly lonely with all my family dead. And here it was, Christmas Day. So I put on big boots and coat and went to do some snow standing. Not since childhood have I done snow standing, I had forgotten how astounding it is. I went to the middle of the woods, fir trees, the teachers of this all around, minus 20 degrees in the wind, but inside the trees is no wind. The word subtracts itself in layers. Outer sounds like traffic and shoveling vanish. Inner sounds become audible. Cracks, sighs, caresses, tweaks, bird breath, tunes squeal. The fir trees move hugely. The white is perfectly curved, stunned with itself. Puffs of ice fog and some gold things float up. Shadows take their motionless across the snow with a vibration of other shadows moving crosswise on them, shadow on shadow, in precise velocities. It is very cold. Then that too begins to subtract itself. The body chills on its surface, but the core is hot. And it is possible to disconnect the surface, to withdraw to the core, where a ravishing peace flows in. So ravishing that I am and embarrassed to use the word ravishing. It is not a piece of separation from the senses, but the washing through peace of looking, listening, feeling at the very core of snow, at the very core of the care of snow. It has nothing to do with Hegel, and I wouldn't admire the clumsily conventional sentences in which I've tried to tell about it, but I suspect if I hadn't been trying on the mood of Hegel's particular grammatical indignation that Christmas Day, I would never have gone out to stand in the snow or stay to speculate with it or had the patience to sit down and make a record of speculation for myself, as if it were a worthy way to spend an afternoon, a plausible way to change the icy horror of a holiday into a sort of homecoming. Merry Christmas from Hegel. In Carson's neat prose, the tension between the effort to reconnect and the unfulfilled desire is palpable. However, the unintended result, the strange fruit of an active passivity, is not entirely hopeless. There is a sort of homecoming. So the chant of the word remains somewhere in the background, even after the post-romantic epistemic retreat. Now, while denied any panoramic vision, the trace of a special desirability generates strange personal rituals of reconnection that reappear generation after generation amid the ruins of an everyday life. This seems to have nothing to do with either the nobility of moral law or the majesty of the starry sky. These are strange poetic rituals whose goal is to keep us in close proximity to something we like to call sublime, only because the word true or essential make us uncomfortable. To sum up, the main fruit of poetically dwelling in what Charles called the interspace consists in our respectful coming near and in the transformative effect that the sheer presence of things can have on those who contemplate them. If only by means of a basic of recognizing effect, Carson's Snow Standing or the flowering apple tree of Nostos, a beautiful poem by Louis Gluck that ends with a haunting sentence. We look at the word once in childhood, the rest is memory. This mode of tentative attention is also a sign of appreciation, a self-altering contact with a strong value, and ultimately the source of the conversion of the gaze. Yeah, I began by speaking about my personal debt to Charles, and The depth I had accumulated before the publication of Cosmic Connections was already huge. But human beings are known to be greedy creatures. So if I could have made a wish for a new book, Charles, I would probably have asked for one that investigates in depth the possible remedies against the spread of a culture of disenchantment today. What can authorize hope, make a new beginning imaginable, thereby giving us the courage to face the unthinkable that stands just behind the corner? Yes, my claim is that today, for critical thinkers, disenchantment is our most dangerous enemy. I think that we badly need to be reminded that poetry is one of the most valuable cures against the disenchantment of the world. After all, what our society lacks today is precisely besonnenheit, thoughtfulness, the ability to restrain oneself, to dwell in an interspace where one can get in touch with a non-masterable reality whose transformative power manifests itself through an uncontrollable good, such as deep resonance. So thank you, Charles, for fulfilling this last wish of mine. My personal gratitude for your tireless efforts in articulating our form of life couldn't be greater, but I'm still in debt. So thank you very much.
Hi, it's been a long day, so I'm going to try to stray a little bit from my notes just to keep you on your toes. But I am I think I'm the only person here who really teaches 19th century poetry on a regular basis. Paolo as well. And because I also work on climate change, I'm going to try to say a couple of things about the new book that will try to bring both of those a little more in focus. So, and I'm going to say more about the book than we were encouraged to do by Dilip, because this is the new book, and I figured that maybe not everybody else has had a chance to work through it yet. So I'm particularly going to talk about poetry, cosmos, and connection, three key terms in the title. And I'm going to do this, of course, with an eye to the potential conversation between literary critics like myself and philosophers like Charles, because we can look at this book and say, finally, here's a philosopher for whom poetic or literary discourse is central to the account of what language is, and a philosopher who takes poetry seriously as a specific mode of writing and reading rather than as a mere vehicle of thought. And this is exactly what literary critics have been asking for from philosophers for generations, so great celebration. So an example of how he does this is his reading of Goethe's Wanderer's Nachtlied. And I just quote the last bit. Over every mountaintop lies peace. In every treetop you scarcely feel a breath of wind. The little birds are hushed in the wood. Wait, soon you too will be at peace. Taylor's main point about this passage is that it does not just draw an analogy between the quiet of the forest and the peace for which you long, nor does it tell you exactly that the forest will deliver that peace, but rather that the moving images of stillness give dimensionality to an aspiration of peace. The poem, he says, has expanded my semantics of aspiration. There is a resonance between the forest and an imagined peace that alters the meaning of both and construes for us a path of yearning and struggle. You will recognize a continuity here with the language animal. The sociocentric, I might notice just parenthetically, the sociocentric theory of language, which Charles undertakes in the language animal, is one of the things that ties him to many other thinkers in the context of the Center for Transcultural Studies. We've got lots of varieties of this, but that does seem to be one of the enduring concerns of the center. And that is to think about constitutive and creative dimensions of language as primary rather than as derivative from denotative and constitutive uses of language and so on. So in this book, Taylor is both working out some of the claims he wanted to make in the language animal, But he's also taking up an entirely new project, which is the situation of poetry in the Romantic and post-Romantic era. Its relation to cosmic order is a challenge or a task to perform rather than a given framework. Cosmic order in this context makes on us an ethical demand of reconstruction that poetry facilitates both by reconstructing our perceptions and aspirations and by working through a progression that convinces us by moving us. So these are connections between this book and Sources of the Self or The Secular Age. I might notice that uh, music comes in from time to time, and the way he imagines poetry to be structured as an event in the 19th century context is remarkably similar to the way music takes on the role of a script for feeling. I have a composer friend who says that his greatest struggle in trying to get distance on the 19th and 20th century musical tradition is that audiences are accustomed to approaching music as a script for feeling, so that there's a moment where everyone is feeling the same thing, and your feelings change in lockstep with the feelings of everyone else in the audience, and that's a powerful conception of music. Romantic poetry is very like that. So a lot of Taylor's account of this situation of poetry is to literary critics relatively familiar from classic studies, which he's leaning on, Earl Wasserman, M.H. Abrams, and others. So I'm anticipating that some of my colleagues in literary criticism will ask what's new here, or what's specifically poetic about cosmic connections. And they will notice that he does not get down in the weeds with the kinds of things that literary critics are often debating these days. So I thought I might just show how there's really interesting resonance between one of the central debates of literary studies in Romantic poetics, since Abrams and Wasserman, and the kind of analysis Charles is doing. And what I have in mind here is a literature about the phenomenon of lyricization. I don't know if anyone in this room might have followed any of this debate, but it starts with the perception that over the late 18th century and throughout the 19th century, lyric gradually becomes the most prestigious genre of poetry, to the degree that the very conception of poetry is formed an image of lyric specifically as a genre, and people begin to forget that there were any other modes of poetry. So no one in the 18th century would really have this problem, because every newspaper had poems on affairs of state. There were broadsides and poster forms of poetry that addressed publics. There were all kinds of genres of poetry, and lyric was a subset. By the time you get to John Stuart Mill, with his famous definition that eloquence is heard, poetry is overheard, he's naturalized the specific conditions of lyric as just the nature of poetry. And notice that it has to do with whether you recognize yourself as addressed or not. Yeah? Eloquence is heard. So, in the time that Mill is writing, in the whole of the 19th century, in America at least, newspapers regularly carried poetry on all their pages. You would see poetry everywhere. It wasn't markedly distinct in context from political oratory. In fact, a lot of the ways that these poems address their readers are public sphere forms of rhetoric. But something changed. And so lyric poetry, in the sense that I'm talking about it, is thought to require no other context than the act of reading itself. This is what distinguishes it from occasional verse or poems on the affairs of state and so on. It works by suspending or qualifying the addressivity of language in a very peculiar way. So when you read a poem as a lyric, you do so because you understand that you both are and are not addressed. You're solicited into a space of intimacy that you can't really inhabit. You are more than what Goffman would call a ratified overhearer. You are a constitutive overhearer, since it is the protocol of lyric reading that allows the poem to be the self-communing of an expressive subject in a time apart from history and in a space that is not exactly social interaction. So an ode can be a ritual of flattery to a person. But when the ode addresses a nightingale, you, no nightingale, are reading it and you are in lyric. So big debates and research programs have developed over the history and theory of this lyric reading, what it enables, what it represses, and how various poets, excuse me, deal with the constraints of this embedding culture of what counts as poetry. So, for example, Virginia Jackson, who's done a lot of the work on the theory of lyric reading, has also got a book about how difficult it is for African American poets to fit themselves into it, because the whole project of African American poetry is a kind of witnessing and testifying to literacy and belonging. And so these poets need, from Phyllis Wheatley to Claudia Rankine, need to foreground their own racial identity in a way that violates the conventions of lyric. So, does Charles Taylor discuss lyricization or such problems of genre? No, he does better. In Cosmic Connections, but especially if you attend to the way this book elaborates and extends sources or secular age or language animal, Taylor accounts for why this generic transformation matters, why it's interesting, how it might be connected to the immanent frame, the inward turn, etc. Questions that are seldom touched on by literary critics in this line of work. Form as a problem in its own right leads us to sideline these background questions. Okay, so that's poetry. And now a word about cosmos. So in the book, Taylor observes that in our time, what our forebears might have thought of as our relation to the cosmos now arises for us as our place and stance in nature. We need a relation to the world, the universe, to things, forests, fields, mountains, seas, analogous to that we have to human beings we love and works of art, where we feel ourselves addressed and called upon to answer. I think that's a wonderful passage. I'm going to come back to it. He thinks that this yearning to construe some kind of connection to nature can be seen in lots of forms. We see this in tourism, he says, visiting parks, trips to the country, seeking beautiful spots, or just in making gardens. Let me note, though, that in Cosmic Connections does not really mean, or does not only mean, such moments of fleetingly felt connection. And that, you have to understand that in order to understand why he would turn to somebody like Baudelaire. Because I think this is a puzzling turn in the book. When you just had a bunch of romantic writing about that feeling of connection, or at least our yearning for it, then we get all of these yards of highly depressive accounts of spleen and a kind of deepening of the sense of alienation. Charles has a great argument about that, which I won't rehearse here. I just mean to point out that the usual popular sense of what people want when they want a connection with nature is only the entry point for this conversation and doesn't really satisfy the conditions that this poetry is calling out. So more on that in a moment. What I want to do here is make 3 observations about the search for cosmic connections by poetic means. One is that what these writers perceived as nature was a very specific historical formation. It arises only after predators such as wolves have been moved to the margin. Nature has to be safe enough for you to contemplate, and only when a reading public could be understood to be freed from the struggle of subsistence. It requires, moreover, not a static nature, but one that could be imagined in long-term equilibrium and such resilience as to be essentially unthreatened by human activity. So Mont Blanc, in Shelley's poem, is beyond good and evil because it's above any sense of peril from human activity, and it's not really involved with human activities such as farming, so that's what gives it its special status. Or to take another example, in Emerson's Nature, he says at the beginning that, of course, we've affected nature through our human arts, but then he says, but take the world as a whole, and everything we've done is just a little chipping, baking, and plastering. In other words, nothing humans do can really affect what nature is in its largest sense. So what we see in the Romantic writers is a perception of Holocene nature as it appears to a middle class. Thus, we might think about how Raymond Williams's account of Romanticism fits into the same story. And of course, there are many varieties. The book is full of emphasis on the way the different writers he takes up treat the basic situation differently. I teach a lot of Emerson, who's very important in the American line. So I noticed that early Emerson developed an environmental consciousness that is deeply spiritual. This is one of the things that's interesting about him historically, is that he gave Americans a reason to think of their relation to land and nature as putting a high spiritual call on them. It wasn't something just given to them. It entails moral, ethical discipline, a total reformation of your personality, and in Thoreau and Whitman, a reformation of the social world. But it also starts with a conception of nature that's theomorphic, benevolent, providential, agential, pastoral in the way that it solicits humans into its own tutelage. And these are aspects of the conception of nature that had to be shed for American writers to get any more serious about the environment. You will never draw from Emerson's vision of nature any reason to stop destroying it. It's Thoreau who starts taking that step. Okay, so think about that benevolent tutor figure of nature who dominates a lot of Wordsworth's accounts, or a poem like Thanatopsis. That's transformative in its moment, but needs to be left behind. A second point here has to do with science. It's important to emphasize that one major line of development in Romantic writing, and this is especially in the US, poets and writers sought to realize a vision of the cosmos that they took directly from the science of their day. Humboldt, especially, Charles touches on this a good deal, on interconnections of what we now call an environment or an ecology, the deep time disclosed by geology and new readings of the fossil record, and so on. So the Romanticism in this context is hardly anti-science. The growing understanding of nature as having its own processes, its own complexity, happens in the very period of colonial development and industrialization But science is not always a means for reducing nature to resources. It can, in fact, be taken as resisting that reduction. So Taylor says that the background against which people are struggling to have this new relation to nature is the long slide toward an increasing focus on the bare materiality of things. And Thoreau says, it carries us so far in Walden, based on his enthusiastic reading of science, as to say, there is nothing inorganic. So he's led to a kind of radical vitalism by his resistance to the objectifying and impersonalizing stance of some of the science that he was nevertheless moved by. But the Holocene perception of nature as inviolable equilibrium can no longer be relied on, at least in any frame that is congenial to human life. The planet might rebalance itself after the sixth extinction, but this is unlikely to inspire us in the way that nature inspired the Romantics. So I'm inviting us to think about climate change as the context for the writing of this book. And finally, let me return to the point earlier about connection being more than just an affect of harmony. So at the beginning of Nature, Emerson gives us a picture of an ecstatic harmony. His famous passage where he says, "Standing on the bare ground, my head bathed by the blithe air and uplifted into infinite space, all mean egotism vanishes. I become a transparent eyeball. I am nothing. I see all. The currents of the universal being circulate through me. I am part or particle of God." Now, for many people, this kind of ecstatic emotional moment is what connection to nature means. And this is why that you would go to a forest or a park in order to have it. But this kind of connection is not Emerson's endpoint, it's his starting point. And he thinks that the stronger claim that nature makes on us has to do with things like moral and intellectual discipline. Oh, why the how are we doing with that? Okay, I'm gonna speed up. But tourism, visiting parks, trips to the country, seeking beautiful spots, for like a beautiful, sublime landscape painting, might give us an affective connection while producing opposite results. It masks the costs of tourism, reconciles park visitors to the routinized high carbon lives to which they return at the end of vacation, etc. So it's ironic to think that people watching nature documentaries on television in air-conditioned homes surrounded by lawns nevertheless persuade themselves that they are experiencing connection to nature. What does connection mean, and how does it address us and call on us, as Charles puts it? So I think this is an increasingly critical question for our time. Affects of cosmic connection come so cheaply in a culture saturated with the rhetoric of the sublime that they may do more harm than good. How do we feel ourselves addressed and called upon to answer, what does connection to the cosmos mean when we ourselves are throwing planetary systems out of equilibrium by almost everything we do? So, inviting Charles to say something about climate change, possibly via Laudato Si, but that's the issue. Thank you.
I said this morning that in this concluding session, we would return to some of what was on the agenda at the first session on a secular age. The jumping off point of Cosmic Connections, this wonderful new book, is a reaction to a secular age, in particular the Enlightenment era, There were important gains, but also pivotal losses. Cosmic connections, details, reaction, and attempts to move forward among romantic and post-romantic poets. Religion was more basic to the definition and being of earlier and other ages. In small-scale societies, which Charles calls tribal in Cosmic Connections, religion was holistically integrated into the collective culture and into the very sense of order of the world itself. Scale mattered in the directness of interpersonal relations and the wholeness of local communities. In ways of enduring significance for Charles, sometimes communitarian, and frequent advocate for a greater decentralization and different relationship to place. This said, I think scale deserves much more examination, not least in relation to place and human being in relation to nature, but also touching on some of the themes that Michael has hinted at. I'm not going to provide that re-examination of scale, only want to signal it. Religion was also central to larger social formations. It was not just confined to these smaller scale societies. It was shaped in these larger social formations, however, by textualization, particularly in prose, not simply in poetry, by production of orthodoxy in relationship to various heterodoxies, rather than something like the doxic attitude that is implied by the integration into those small-scale societies, shaped by relationship to states, by competition and conversion, and by pluralization, multiple and overlapping allegiances, and sometimes compartmentalization. So the era of a religious society, to borrow or a religious age, to borrow Rajiv Bhargav's for, isn't seamless. There's a very different sense of a religious age between the sort of doxic reality of what Charles describes as tribal societies, deeply connected to place and fully integrated in relation to nature, and larger scale, but still very religious societies, indeed the societies that produce the category of religion, which are not the small scale societies, so that the immediate precursor accounts of religion, to which the Enlightenment objects in many ways and from which it moves, need to be thought that way. Secular thought and life, moreover, exist in such ages, the religious ages, not centrally defined by the secular. Right? We can call these religious ages, but this is a shortcut that includes a lot of variety. Likewise, there are a variety of secularisms in a secular age, and in a secular age, the capitalized book title. One of the features of Charles's book, A Secular Age, is to give us an account of the multiple secularisms of an era that is also a secular age. Something that Michael and I in a collaboration have emphasized. Religion does not disappear in secular ages any more than religious ages were all religion all the time. I'll pause on this, right? To say that there was an era in which there was lots of religion, even religious wars, struggles over religious orthodoxy, frequent engagements with controversies over doctrine, doesn't mean that everybody was doing all religion all the time. These were eras in which people were doing a variety of other things as well, and there were various forms of relation to religion. It remains important, religion remains important in post-Enlightenment, post-scientific revolution, secular age, but it's changed by the recontextualization. So a lot of the account of the secular age is about not irreligion, but the recontextualization of religion in a different era. And this is picked up in the account of Cosmic Connections. And poetry and the examination, deep reading of poetry becomes a vehicle for thinking this recontextualization. Conditions of belief and action shift along with the rise of a new sort of public and a new constitution of self as project. Faith and belief become more difficult, less uniform, less ubiquitous, less widely distributed, and potentially more profound. And this is a key relationship to Chuck's thinking about self and the transformations of the eras. Romantic and post-Romantic poets did not simply contest secularization and nationalism or seek to turn back rationalism or seek to turn back the clock. Their motto was not make the Middle Ages great again. There are religious traditionalists today whose motto is something like make the Middle Ages great again. So just be clear, this isn't what was being described here. The Romantics did sometimes revisit past thinkers, and very often past art and architecture and other kinds of relics, but centrally sought new and different modes of access to these transcendent spiritual sources, not a return. Here, poetry itself was and is crucial. By poetry, I mean, as Charles does, the genre, right? And with variations within it, but the genre in which one has rhythm and music and imagery and often remade language, not simply a message translatable into the standard terms of correspondence. This connects, and I'm not going to make and develop a connection to what Michael was just saying about lyricization. It seems in very important ways, in the way in which the reading of poetry works. In a further footnote to this, as Virginia Jackson, whom he emphasizes, has also written about the widespread anxiety who reads poetry. The anxiety who reads poetry is a reflection of the fact that reading poetry is not anymore a standard part of the public discourse about public affairs. This is not the 17th or even all versions of the 18th century in this. It's not a common denominator part of public discourse. It's getting set apart. I'm going to, for reasons of time, skip one anecdote about that, but let me give you another anecdote as I transition to a second part of this. When Charles was awarded the Templeton Prize, I had the good fortune to be invited to join in some of the celebration. And it was great to have Charles awarded this, but it was not without a certain kind of misunderstanding, or at least tenuous understanding. The Templeton Prize is the Templeton Prize for Progress in Religion, in which progress in religion is understood on the model of progress in science. And this isn't obviously the way one might think about religion in a Taylorian mode. And this led to interesting discourse. Sir John Templeton, endowing the prize, modeled on technological scientific progress, which he thought were seamlessly integrated with growth in capitalist economies. So there was a logic of spiritual discoveries, very much like the discovery of resources that could be deployed in capitalist economies and used by modern technology. This led to a challenging conversation with the founder's son, Jack Templeton, Sir John Templeton's son, John Jr., and Chuck, as they found a common way to celebrate Chuck's award, and Chuck struggled to have it not be constantly described in this model of scientific progress. Now, some of the ways in which this is discussed in Cosmic Connections, I think, are significant for us. The theme I want to develop is one that Michael's already signaled in his discussion of the epiphanic, but I want to take it in a slightly different direction and talk about translation, expression, the phrase subtler languages, which Charles borrows from Wasserman, from Earl Wasserman, whom Michael referred to, and the idea of the specificity of experience. So what's going on with this reading of poetry, which is set apart from the common denominator of public discourse in some fashion. Charles talks about an epistemic retreat, but I think we have to see the epistemic retreat for poetry alongside a kind of epistemic onslaught of science and certain other technological reason in general. That is, the retreat for poetry appears as the signs of nature cease to be directly readable, as they were, for example, in allegory, And nonetheless, the ideal of combining freedom with unity of nature remains. So there's an ideal that sets up a potential disappointment there, and of a challenge of trying to find ways to read nature when it is no longer self-evident, but also not read it the way that it is going to be read by the growing techno-science world in terms of causal naturalism, arguably dispensing with what has been called the problem of meaning. And the very structure of the phrase reveals this idea, well, meaning, that's a problem. We've got to get that out of the way in order to be able to address the nature of natural science. Romantic and post-romantic poetry, in this vein, makes present, but does not precisely theorize nature and relations to nature, and figuring out what is going on from Haman and the idea of translation forward through all of this is key. And I'm just going to note a couple of references to this, not by any means reproduce what Chuck has called. But several things are relevant. So one of the questions is how to embrace nature. And most of the ways of embracing nature, rely on the Holocene conception that Michael called nature as more or less self-moving and not changed by the human contact, and therefore separate from the human. So it's an approach to nature, but it's set up on the basis of a separation from the human. There can be an advancing subjectivity and freedom at the same time that this approach is made, but also alienation. And poetry can appear as a partial recovery from the alienation. But what it can't become in this is a new, neutral public language. It can bring connection and closeness to nature, but in a different register. Now, Taylor goes through wonderfully a multiplicity of responses. Let me just call attention. So this is not simply about the Romantic era and Romantic poetry, because it turns in part on the shifts among early Romantic, late Romantic, and post-Romantic thinkers whose orientations are different, which is a shift in part from a part of different kinds of relations to religion and transcendence. So there is a different relationship to the notion of transcendence for the early Romantics than from some of the later shift. And although it is signaled as being overwhelmingly about the German Romantics in the beginning of this, and that is its root conceptualization, lots of time is spent on various French and English and other poets in this. It doesn't stay as centrally focused on the Germans as it was announced, or as, say, the language animal in its theory of language does. Later poets in this story would emphasize sense, feeling, and experience. For example, constituting nature as organismic, not mechanistic, and ourselves in an intense emotional relationship to it, the epiphanic that Michael talked about, the idea of nature resonating with us, poetry mediating, but also intensifying the relationship, this changed relationship to nature. This is all against a background in which allegory or the great chain of being don't get restored. This isn't putting back in place that kind of world. It's constituting a world of exceptional experiences, not systemic articulations. Charles writes, the intensified experience may offer no general picture of our relationship to the cosmos. It may offer no concept describing this relationship, like force or God. And second, it articulates and transforms this particular experience, what we live in our immediate surroundings. Okay, so it's not producing the forces of modern physical science, but it's not reproducing God necessarily in all of this. And so we have a question about the kinds of relationships to the cosmos that are being offered. What are the sorts of connections here? Let me take Tintern Abbey, which Chuck does, as Wordsworth's Tintern Abbey, as a way of evoking this. And I'm not going to go through the whole because he comes to it twice and expands his reading of it as he goes along. But let me just note an aspect of what's been involved. We're quoting Tintern Abbey. And I have felt a presence that disturbs me with the joy of elevated thoughts, a sense sublime of something far more deeply interfused, whose dwelling in the light of setting suns, and the round ocean and the living air, and the blue sky and the mind of man, a motion and a spirit that impels all thinking things, all objects of thought, and rolls through all things. Well, this kind of poetry is engaged in a representation of nature and its enormous force and significance for us, right? But in this model of a nature out there. Heyman introduces, as I think I said, a notion of translation, a particular meaning of translation. So the task of the poet, early romantics especially, is to translate this kind of experience of nature into the ways, the meaning for humans, in which they can grasp it. But this is not a neutral reading. It is a rendering in a different language, and language comes to matter more and more basically and in multiple ways. Heyman called this a recreation in our minds of the discussion that Wasserman and thinkers like Ungerser bring to this is the poet transforms the described landscape into poetic myth through interpretive language. Now, that's a lot to unpack, but let me note that's not quite our ordinary understanding of translation in an everyday sense. It's not a neutral rendering in different words of the same thing. It's a transformation, first off. It's the creation of myth, a poetic myth, and it involves interpretative language, not neutral language in this. So translation is a problematic term for transformation that remains open-ended. Wasserstrom's term subtler languages may help to get at that, but it sets up a sort of problematic for the world of that we live in still, and the questions that Michael's raised about whether we live in a changed world in relation to nature. So since I'm using up all the available time, let me turn to the end of it quickly. The end of readable nature, or the refusal of the causal naturalist model of readable nature, is a turn in part to symbolism at first and an opaque sense of symbolism. It's a turn to the expression in poetry as that which cannot be said in any other way. So the Tintern Abbey passage or something is an attempt to evoke something seen. There's a lot of description in it, but it is something said that can't be said in any other way, paradigmatically. And in this, there's an inescapable plurality, but there's a reliance on new mythologies, so that this era of finding these new relationships to nature becomes an era of making new mythologies, potentially as many new mythologies as poets. And this is part of how we will work. At the same time, nature is not static, but comes to its fullest realization in this conception of it, along with and through our own self-realization as rational and free beings, right? So nature, right, has a telos. It has not just a simple being in this, has a way of remaking itself. The framing shifts in the course of these different romantic eras of romantic poetry toward the temporal, towards a reframing not simply of the translation of nature, but towards history and higher time. You know, Baudelaire, post-Baudelaire into Proust, we've got a somewhat different story. And we've got ideas like advancing through loss and the role of self-sacrifice, artistic or other, alongside nature untouchable or resilient. The way this will change then is in that progression as an idea of deep time, for example, emerges, and the historicity of what's being evoked. It's not just higher time, not just the future, now it's geological deep time and so forth. The I will skip over and not say that the insane Enlightenment era transformed the idea and reality of publics. But in this world of publics of various kinds, there is a shift in context for both religious seekers and dwellers, those who take up politics to protect religion, promulgate religion, change policy in accord with religion, but also poets who are engaged in this reconstitution, sometimes called translation, of relationship to nature, which is, among other things, in tension with any notion that public discourse could be a perfect commensuration. So part of what poetry will stand for in the Romantic tradition is the incommensurability of vision and speech, that there are these important. And that's particularly true for the epiphanic. But it's worth noting that Charles lays out not only the huge importance of the epiphanic, that is, of flashes of insight into dominant meanings or emotions or insights of any particular situation, and notions that there is some sort of encompassing order. So are the cosmic connections merely fleeting, irreducible, not fully commensurable, plurality of different relationships that reveal transcendence, that reveal the radical capacity of something beyond the quotidian? Or, right, is there a role of cosmic connection here through poetry that transcends this brute pluralism, that makes something more and more shared than these separate epiphanic experiences allow, at the same time that there's not a challenge of commensuration? So Chuck concludes, and I will conclude, by asking questions about moral progress in all of this. I'm leaping over a little bit here to get to this, but just as there is this transformation in our modes of relating to nature and world and each other, right? Is there a moral progress? Chuck says that could mean three things. More morality. No, there isn't a moral progress. That we have higher ideals, maybe, but it's not sure that's even clear that's even helpful, since it may just enable us or cause us to lie more about not reaching our ideals. More profound insights and wider distribution of profundity, previously regarded as heroic, so that the profound insights were reserved for a very few exceptional saints, as in our earlier discussion, or others in the axial age, are now potentially a feature of the life of all individuals, aided perhaps by reading poetry, against any instrumentalization of progress. Is this then a resource for the production of meaning by which to have specific personal acts of faith and ethical insight, but also to make these disruptions against the instrumental progress alleged to be our reality? Thanks.
Thank you, Craig. Thank you to the three of you for these very rich and sophisticated engagements with Charles's last book. Okay.
Usually a convener or co-convener thanks at the end of the symposium, but this is an unusual one, so I don't want to end this symposium giving thanks, the ritual of giving thanks. Instead, I want this symposium to end with the words of Charles Taylor. So let me give the thanks. And there are 4 communities here at least, and there are more. I would like to thank the McGill community represented by Jocelyn and all of his colleagues who have made it possible and participation. And I'd like to thank the community of Center for Transcultural Studies, all those people who have participated, come here and supported me in trying to organize this. I'm really grateful to my colleagues in Center for Transcultural Studies. And then there are all people who have come from all over the world who are part of Charles's so-called global connections, if not cosmic connections. All those people are here represented. Many of them are not able to be here, but those who are here represent that global network. And finally, you know, the audience is full of his members of his family who represent the best of Montreal, best of Quebec, and good for kind of a tolerant and multilingualism, bilingualism of this city and this state. So I'm very grateful they are here and who have contributed to making this success. So that is part of my Thanksgiving. I mean, to all of you. But there's also two remarks I want to make. One is, while I should be smiling because it's such a success, I'm also very humbled by this. That is, after hearing all these people, having known Charles for more than 36 or 38 years, I sort of wonder, you know, that do I really know this man? Because there's so many things said about him, so many parts of his life which I didn't know, even though 36 years, and the kind of impact he has made on other people and all. So it's a very humbling experience. So I'm humbled by all the things that you said about Charles Taylor, his life and work. The second one is I've been engaged with Charles in doing various projects. When you engage with a person in doing various projects, whether it's a summer course in Budapest or a conference in Northwestern or conference workshop in Vienna or something like that, you are sort of engaging in a pragmatic, instrumental way where you are engaging in a part of the person. And when you're doing all these kind of parts of engaging a part of person, getting him there, making sure everything is in place and so on, sometimes it appears that you lose a grasp of the whole of Charles Taylor. And what I learned today from all of the people who are presenting it, what Charles Taylor as a whole is there, as a total human being. And so sometimes I had this feeling of anxiety. There's all this excess, all this exposure to Charles Taylor. Have I learned enough from him the way other people seem to have heard? So I leave with both this experience of humbling and this experience of anxiety. But nevertheless, it has been a great pleasure to have known him all these times. And he is that life affirming, committed human being who keeps somebody who's ironic and detached like me in place. So without me spiraling into some kind of a, madness. And that's why I'm indebted to him. So that is the way I can pay tribute and say thank you, Charles, keeping me from going mad with my own skepticism.
I concur with Dilip. I've found this also a very humbling experience because, let's use this. A very humbling experience because you can see how what you've done is seen by other people in all sorts of other contexts. Sometimes the really rich idea, rich example comes from somebody else's looking at your work. So the sense I might have had from some of the kind things said here that I'm this great source of new ideas is that letting my work be looked at by other people is a great source, anyway, for me of new ideas and sure for others. And just the last two speakers are good illustration of this. I mean, Michael, this very, very interesting seeing the other side of the development of the new kind of poetry in the Romantic period, seeing it as an evolution of the very idea of poetry, seeing the definition of lyric and so on. All this is extremely interesting, and I had some sense of it, but it really escaped me. So the whole area I was opening up actually could have been seen in a lot of other ways, and it's a area which is evolution of this poetry in the 19th century is actually an area
which is a very rich mind, which seeing with other eyes, the way Craig has in one way, and Michael in another, seeing with other eyes, just as interesting and fascinating and rich conclusions can be drawn. So that's one important thing that I wanted to say. But the other is a little bit to look at where I come from all this, is where I want to go from all this. The issue has been put, I think it was by Michael, but others too, have put this set of issues in the context of our ecological crisis, in the context of our threatened destruction of our whole environment. And of course, that was there the whole time in worrying me, because I've been, like all of you, I've got more and more alarmed. And the more alarmed, the more important centers of power remain totally unalarmed by this. The recent US election was more or less, first of all, because of the absurd original idea of Trump that the crisis is a hoax. But then because of the fear the Democrats had of ever challenging this. And you look with astonishment at the summer in the United States, where masses of people had their lives totally disrupted, in some cases drowned and so on. And everybody is telling them, everybody who knows anything, it's going to be much worse next year. And if you don't do anything, it's going to be much worse next year. And in face of all this, they're all behaving as though it was a hoax. So you can see how you can't not think of this book in terms of the crisis. And so what could I hope that in a tiny way this might help to alert? Well, because if you can see through any of these lenses that we're looking at, you can see what it means for the human sense of meaning, for the human sense of living in a safe home. If you can see any of these, you see immediate consequences, which are very, very important. I want to relate this a bit more closely into the unity or lack of unity of the book. That what I'm presenting is this picture across history and across different cultures of how the planet, the common home, has been tremendously important, but in totally different ways, in very different languages, from certain forms of Aboriginal religion right through to, Alexander von Humboldt and 20th century authors. And this poses a big puzzle for all of us. There must be some very important common source of this. It's all human societies, but these sources yield modes of expression, modes of concern, which are totally different, don't seem to have any. So one of the things that I thought it would be good if it emerged from this, with all this incompleteness, is to recognize the extreme variety of human concern for the planet, for nature, for various words are used for this, the tremendous variety and form, but there's a kind of fundamental underlying relationship to these. They can recognize each as cousins of others. In other words, being worked up about romantic poetry and its development, I can see Aboriginal religions as they occur right next door in our society in a new light. It's not possible for me to dismiss them as relatively unimportant when I see the actual picture which emerges from this book of changes in the common elements. So I didn't mean at all to ignore that, and I'm quite well aware of the ironies that, for instance, both I think Craig and Michael point out that some of the ways we satisfy our sense of reconnection with nature, like watching certain television programs, right, involve various interventions in nature, the introduction of all this equipment into areas and so on, which or build on the transformation of wilderness into agriculture, for instance, which beyond a certain point is part of the problem, is part of the danger. So with this tremendous a lot of complication and multifacetedness, and also of tension and contradiction in trying to answer this, in trying to feed this desire or this hunger or this thirst for contact with nature. And all that has to be taken on board. And I would say that finally, when you look at all this together, there's something else that comes out of this, I think, discovery or heightened consciousness that we have this unified history in the continuous concern with the relation with nature, coupled with tremendous changes in the way it comes through. And that's something that we have to take account of practically when we look at what I mentioned just a minute ago, that our concern to come close to nature may be part of the problem, maybe part of what's preventing us from saving nature. But it also should make us look at our common home as the locus of many, many different kinds of connection and forms that it can take. Right? So just as we see this planet as if you like, the origin of the lodestar, the lodestone of this deep concern with many different forms, so, because I also wanted to discuss this general theme of cosmic connection in terms of time, and how this can enable us to understand history in a different way. So I didn't hesitate, though it was perhaps very foolish, to introduce a chapter on what I call the history of ethical growth. Now, this idea doesn't start with the study of nature. It didn't start with me. The famous thesis of an axial era, which I still find very striking because of the similarity of at least four, but maybe also others, at least four big shifts, roughly the same time in history, but which, with no plausible explanation, is there of a diffusion kind. That Plato went on a journey and he met Confucius, and the idea passed on. Some kind of, and if you look at the diachronic story, well, I think Craig was right. I don't know if I'm in any way disagreeing with him. This progress, which I really see, it doesn't make us better in the sense that when we turn around and violate the higher standards we've come to set ourselves with declarations like the Universal Declaration of Human Life, when we get around to the Holocaust and the atrocities of the Bolshevik regimes and so on, if we run through them, they're more horrifying than anybody else would have managed to mount, partly because of not having the means. They're more horrifying than some of the very greatest, most arresting horrors of history. But there are two important changes which, in a certain sense, can't be denied as steps forward. The first is what people call the morals dimension of ethics. The rules we moved from the Ten Commandments, maybe if you want to put it that way, to the 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And we've moved to this through different stages in which a lot of things which are thought to be very undesirable, but you can't really do without them, like slavery throughout most of history, even the highest religions have said, okay, we have to allow for it. To a sense, as a civilization, that this is just off the chart. This is not permissible. And yes, worse than slavery has been inflicted. But what's interesting and impressive in some ways is that nobody can admit this. When Xi Jinping is taxed with treatment of the Uyghurs, wiping out of their culture to make of them rational Han Chinese, etc., he doesn't say, of course, it's the path of rationality. He says American propaganda. Some things become inadmissible. So but is that progress? I think it is in a way. But the second thing that I tried to single out in that chapter was another kind, which is new possibilities, which I want to call ethical because it's to do with what's a really good, full human life. New possibilities of fulfilled human life, which are aimed to a much higher form of life. Let's think of two really. One is, of course, the slavery one. But the other, if you take recent world history from Gandhi through Martin Luther King, through other workers in a nonviolent form of self-liberation, to truth and reconciliation commissions as a way of bringing about. You have here, we have something which is not simply in the domain of rules, don't do this, don't do that, don't do that. In the model of the Universal Declaration, you have people who are reaching for and moved by a higher form, ethical life, higher form of human life. So with Gandhi, I think really crucial step was taken here because you had to get rid of this alien rule. It was in a way inhuman, certainly utterly unjustifiable of colonialism. And a lot of people said, okay, let's take up arms. And somebody came along and said, look, it's a higher form of life if you can do this without using violence. And if you can prepare a future in which the oppressors and the oppressed, children of the oppressors and the oppressed, can live together with a sense of mutual enrichment. And I think very much the same thing in the civil rights movement. This wonderful expression by John Lewis, put down the burden of hatred. Well, why is hatred a burden? Why is hatred a burden? If these people are lower than you, why do you concern yourself? Because difference enriches human life. And this is not a goal framed in the negative form of thou shalt not or don't do this. It's a positive goal. It's saying there's a higher form of human life. And I'm tremendously encouraged in the small struggles that we have from time to time and in this society, among others, at the way in which a large number of people of younger generation in a number of different, anyway, Western societies have come to feel that getting to know people very different is a very important enrichment in their lives. So you're not just lecturing at them anymore, just saying, don't do this, it's very bad, this is very harmful. It's an invitation to a fuller form of life. And if you can overturn a lot of dictatorships, as was done around around 1990, by totally nonviolent means, the whole of that range of regimes in Eastern Europe, with the partial exception, of course, of Romania, were toppled without any blood being shed. And that is, so this is a great achievement for the, 3 cheers for the human race. We did that. And we did that because we had a higher ethical vision, which really took hold of people. So I think that this whole set of issues about the relation to the common home, to nature, to the universe on one hand, and the elaboration of higher and more fuller ethical lives on the other, shows these are two things that are shared on this planet by all the human beings and influencing each other. And it doesn't stop horrifying backsliding, but it does give another further destination to ethical growth. So I'm sure I got it all wrong in detail. It can be endlessly changed and modified and made better. But I see in these ethical developments something harbinger maybe of a human history, future history, which is less horrifying than our past. Well, I'm sorry to have gone on so long, but thank you very, very much for sticking with it. Thank you.